I wanted to join in the game, and one of the boys I distinctly remember looked at me and said, "You're not allowed to play. Black people don't play Yu-Gi-Oh."
Welcome back, guys, to the Talking Reality podcast. You're here with Mike
and Nathan.
And today we've got our guest, Sabrina. Hi, Sabrina.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Sabrina.
Hi,
nice to have you on.
And we'll be talking the reality of racism. So before we get into this, guys, I just think it's important we just put a bit of a disclaimer out there that the topics we'll be covering are our personal experiences. So we don't represent an entire race. We represent ourselves, the things we've witnessed and really experienced. Do we all agree?
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah, of course. I think it's important to reiterate that to all our listeners and viewers, that these are our views and our guests' views. And ultimately, there'll be elements of our conversation I'm sure people can relate to.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, these are our views.
Yeah. Okay then, Sabrina. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So thank you, guys, again for bringing me along.
Good to have you. Good to have you on here.
So I am Bristol born. My
Yeah.
parents are Jamaican, so they came over to this country in the early 1970s.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been brought up in mainly Down End, Emerson's Green area. If you know that part of Bristol, it's mainly very kind of suburban, so I wasn't brought up in inner city Bristol. Went to the local primary schools, secondary schools. I studied history at Manchester Metropolitan. Reason why I did that degree was because I've always had an interest in looking at history and how people conducted themselves, to previous generations and how those previous people influenced ourselves today.
Yeah.
And the other part of it was I've always had the interest of having a better understanding of my own heritage. As I said, that my parents are Jamaican, and with the whole big wind rush that happened in the 1950s, there was a big influx of Caribbean immigrants. So I wanted to have a better understanding of how Caribbean immigrants influence British history in terms of music, culture, food, so on and so forth, to feel a little bit more closer in a sense to what my understanding is of British identity.
So I guess your parents' experience coming over here would differ from yourself as time's moved on.
Yeah.
What sort of things did they experience when they first come to the UK?
So one of the things that definitely, from speaking with my own parents, was about the school system.
Yeah.
You can imagine that when they were coming over to Britain, that the school system wasn't exactly that diverse or inclusive at that time compared to nowadays. If you think about the kind of school calendar, there's a lot more inclusivity about different people's religions and focus on Black History Month, for instance. Black History Month was just this recent October. So you can imagine for my parents, they didn't really feel like they sometimes were welcomed coming into the country, and especially in school. There wasn't really a lot of talk about, we've have these Caribbean immigrants coming over into the country, and, this is kind of the reasons why they're coming over and so forth. So they sometimes would feel a little bit certain away and didn't feel like they were welcomed. Whereas with me, it was a lot more. There was a lot more focus on including everybody that came from different backgrounds, whether you were Caribbean, whether you were Asian, so and so forth. There was a lot more inclusivity.
Do you think maybe there's been an evolution in that sense in terms of the education system is, I think, slow, but it is adapting and getting better, maybe, including people from all sorts of different cultures, religions. But I think ultimately, you touched briefly on what your parents, I suppose, introduction to Britain was like. Did you say they came here in the 1970s?
Yep, late 1960s, early 1970s, around that period.
So how old were they when they came here?
So my dad came over when he was 8 years old, and my mum came over when she was 5 years old. And the thing to bear in mind is, for both of my parents, when they were being brought up in Jamaica, they were being brought up by their grandparents and essentially by their local community within their local village. They came over to Britain during the dead of winter when they didn't really know their parents because, of course, it was their grandparents that brought them. So not only did they have to get used to knowing these brand new sets of people that should be your parents and you should have that kind of close familial relationship with, they had to deal with that personal thing, but then they also had to deal with coming into a new country and understanding the people and the culture and feeling that they have to fit in, because of course there wasn't really a lot of people similar to them within their own area that they were living with. Anyway,
big
so they
culture
did
shock.
it was a big culture shock, and then you can imagine as well at that time there wasn't that great focus, especially within the British government, about inclusivity and diversity, and there's been countless times that mum has talked to myself of saying that she walked to school and there would be buildings with the slur of wogs go home, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine as a young child coming from Jamaica to the UK and not feeling welcomed, their perception of racism was very overt. It was right in their face at times.
I think, I mean, ultimately, I can't even begin to relate to that, but from my perspective, I think one of the sad things about that is that obviously your parents came here in the time where technology was nowhere near as advanced as it is today. So I guess you wouldn't be, the world was smaller almost.
Yeah.
In that, you wouldn't, I guess your experiences would be your experiences. You wouldn't be aware of how someone in America might be struggling, or someone in, in Africa or Australia. I mean, ultimately it must have been and probably your parents' world at that young age.
Yeah.
They must have just thought, oh, well, that's just normal. Like you walk past and see that on a building, that's normal. That must happen everywhere in the world. And it's, it's quite...
I would imagine as well, because it would go unchallenged, like especially back then.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like people were socialised into this is the norm, this is the way it is. So I guess a lot of people coming here from abroad would have just almost had that expectation this is going to happen, but we're in a country where perhaps there might be some better opportunity for us.
Oh, yeah.
And just sort of kind of negotiate and say, okay, well, it's worth it because the next generation will have a better opportunity than what we had.
Well, yeah, in terms of the opportunities that my mum and dad have had since living in the UK compared to if they were living in Jamaica, it does kind of balance it out, because like for myself, they've been able to provide for me and my brothers greatly. Because of their help, I managed to get into university. I know definitely I would not be where I am if it wasn't for their hard work. My mum was working 2 jobs to get me through college and university, because I mean, if you look at university prices now, $9,000 for tuition and the maintenance loan and everything, there's no way, even just with a part-time job, that I would have been able to sustain myself.
Would your parents have had the opportunity to go to university back in Jamaica?
Not to the same degree in the UK, most definitely not. Definitely, of course, not to say that if you were in Jamaica, there's no way that you could get into university, but the accessibility, definitely not to the same degree. One of the kind of first things that I learned about racism in the sense of being taught through the education system was the American slave trade. I think that's always kind of the main history topic that's brought up when you're in primary as well as in secondary school. But my even my kind of understanding and looking at it of racism, especially during that, was more of that even though there was racism towards these African enslaved Africans, that it was more of just as an economic system rather than, the horrible and abuse of these people being ripped away from their homelands and brought over to a foreign country and people are shouting at them saying you're no longer going to be using your birth given name, now have to be you're now going to essentially be under a new identity. I would no longer be Sabrina Trusty anymore. I would be whatever you have told me I'm going to be. If you told me my name is now going to be Sarah Baxter, that is it. That is
So you would
my
have
life
to
now.
adopt the name of whoever was owning
Yeah.
you, I guess.
And what I kind of found interesting, and I think that's the reason why I wanted to study British history and kind of my understanding of how British history sees itself in relation to these particular topics, is because it was so glazed over during secondary school that it was just an economic system. Whereas if you look at other history topics such as the Holocaust, there was a lot more detail on, this is the terrible treatment that the Jews went under from the Nazi government. You saw the pictures, you saw the
Some
videos.
very graphic images in those textbooks.
And there wasn't that much from when I was in primary and secondary school. There wasn't that much focus on the harsh treatment. It was more just that it was an economic system that brought in money to Britain, and we profited off of it. And a lot of the money went back into the government, went back into the education system. I mean, we could, I think we might talk about it at some point, but looking at Edward Colston in Bristol, he was a slave trader, but a philanthropist. Got the word? Is it philanthropist?
Philanthropist.
That's the one.
Yeah.
The profits that he made went back into Bristol, went back into the education system, supported the schools, Colston girls' schools. So, yeah.
So when obviously we all got educated to some degree on the slave trade, although it was quite minimal and it was kind of glazed over, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
How did your peers take that class? I mean, did they just walk out that class and do you think it just left their head, or do you think they actually thought about the severity of the slaves that would have been on those ships?
I think it was definitely, from my personal experience and when speaking to my peers in secondary school at the time, talking about that topic, there wasn't really much resonance with them because, of course, the way that they saw it wasn't directly affecting them. It wasn't affecting their kind of their family line. Yeah. Whereas, of course, the slave trade is going to be affecting me personally, because Jamaica was essentially created through enslaved Africans. That is where my family line came from. And it would make, and come on the flip side, where we're talking about World War II and with Nazi Germany, I don't have any family members, or from my understanding from looking at my own personal family history, there wasn't really anybody that was involved in World War II going out on the missions and so on and so forth. But I know there were a couple of my peers whose grandfather and great-great-grandfather was involved in World War II and going out and fighting on the battle. So I can understand that they would be more inclined to feel a little bit of a closer connection and fighting the Germans and so on and so forth, and trying to help out the Jews and everything. So
I think it's almost like so obviously when we finish these podcast episodes, and anyone who does a podcast episode knows you then comes the editing, and when you edit something, you choose your favourite parts, don't you?
You're not going to put out. Very good point, man.
You're not going to put out all the bits you don't like. So that's almost like what our education system has done over time. It's picked out its favourite parts, or where Britain
and where we look great,
where Britain looks good, i.e. World War II.
Yeah.
And kind of omits the periods in history where people have not shown themselves in the greatest light. And I think, but ultimately, it's important that people understand what's happened, what's gone wrong, so people can be better, so human beings can be better and do better.
Well, what I was going to say, I was going to raise one further point, is the experiences that my parents had, especially with racism, was very overt. It was in their face.
Yeah,
you could not really escape from it. It was right there. Whereas the racism that I say that I experience today is not overt. It's more, I'm just trying to find the right words. It's more of the certain language that's used by certain political party leaders. It's by the words that is used in the media as well, alluding to certain stereotypes, which then fuels prejudice. You can link it to some of the things that I've seen actually regarding the whole campaign with Brexit. Now, I understand with Brexit that it was just simply coming out of the EU market, but for some of the comments that I was seeing around the debates, it was almost as though get all the foreigners out of the country, and I've seen that kind of rhetoric a lot of the time, that whenever something happens and it's not for the majority of the population within the UK, which is mostly white people, is if it means that a minority is creating a negative effect, the first thing to do, that I'm seeing these type of comments, is just deport them, get them out. They are foreigners, and it makes me kind of question about my own British identity, because I am born here. I have every right to claim that I am British.
Yeah.
I was born here. I've paid my taxes. I've been brought up in the education system. I've been brought up in British culture. But yet you'll see these certain comments sometimes that if it was somebody like myself who's done something wrong, the first thing that is told, that because I've done something that is against the norm or maybe even illegal, I should be deported because I'm not technically British. So when it's coming on to racism of today, I still feel you have those undertones of you're British, but you're not truly British, and you may never be fully truly British until, let's say, I have a child with somebody who is white, and my children and their children mix more with the majority, that almost my heritage line is almost disappeared.
What, I suppose, like I said, don't answer if you don't want to, but what personal racism have you suffered?
Okay. So I mean, the earliest experience I remember having was, funny enough, in primary school. I was playing with these bunch of boys, and do you remember the old Yu-Gi-Oh cards?
Yeah,
I wanted to join in the game, and one of the boys, I distinctly remember, looked at me and said, "You're not allowed to play. Black people don't play Yu-Gi-Oh." And I was a little bit caught off guard because, I mean, I never kind of heard of
Yeah.
people saying that to me, because, I mean, at my young age, I was like, what? Why can't I play Yu-Gi-Oh? I've never heard that black people can't play Yu-Gi-Oh. I've seen my brother used to play Yu-Gi-Oh with his friends. So I asked him, and again, I was like, what do you mean that I can't play? And he was like, no, black people aren't allowed to play Yu-Gi-Oh. It's not your game. And he was really quite forward on it. I told the teachers, and of course he got a telling off, but that always stayed with me, because I always did kind of wonder, was that something that he learned from maybe his parents or from his own family, or was that from his own understanding of looking at society, that certain groups of people, certain communities like the black community, aren't allowed to do certain things because that's not it's not allowed to us, essentially. You know?
It's an interesting question because, like you said, it could be something they've just formulated themselves.
Yeah.
Or, my opinion, more than likely, it stemmed from learnt behaviour.
Yeah.
Right, from the people around them. It might not be their parents. It might be someone else's child, and they might have learnt it from their parents, or do you know what I mean? So it's hard to like pinpoint those things down.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it boils back down to education.
I think racism is always going to be a quite contentious topic, because I remember speaking to you even before we started this podcast. Some people, because they have not been within an environment of being around people of different cultures, when they hear about things on the news about racism, they're like,
massively,
racism, it's not really that big of a thing. Or, the best statements I've heard is, well, I've personally never seen racism, so it can't really be that bad. But you can't, I understand personally for you that the person who may not have personally seen racism,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to have that viewpoint that it's not that big of a deal. But you need to have an understanding that you can't push your personal views on somebody who has gone through that personal experience. You can't negate my own personal experience because it is something that I have gone through myself.
I think one of the issues is if you go back to your parents' sort of day when they were young, and it was more of the sort of overt racism, and prior to them, you know, the real hardcore stuff that still goes on in America with like the KKK and these sort of cult ideologies.
Yeah.
We've almost sort of shifted a bit sideways from that and into this covert racism era where people have these prejudice thoughts, sometimes subconsciously, because again they've been socialized into this, and we're almost in like some people I feel are in like a denial phase that they're not a racist because they've never really challenged their own thoughts. I think it's important that we every now and again we do need to challenge our thoughts and try and learn off other people, because sometimes we can be so ignorant to anything really, and I think we're all guilty of that to a certain extent, but that's why it's so important now and again. You just got to check yourself, like am I thinking this because of this?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's like that Sarah Everard case that's just happened. This different topic, but ultimately I said to you, didn't I, after that, like I can never imagine how scared a woman must be going home from a night out, because I've never had to experience that. It doesn't affect us.
As a male,
but then you start thinking about things and think, God, yeah, we, you know, that must be a really scary thing for a woman.
Yeah.
And it's totally crazy that that's even a thing, that women should have to be scared to go home from a night out. But it is it's reality. There's evil people out there, unfortunately, and I mean, yeah, you're right. You have to challenge your own thoughts. You have to challenge, you know, just your own basic thinking, and you know, just put yourself in other people's shoes.
I still get those thoughts to this day, because for me, going into a workplace, my not so much a worry, but something I always have my guard up about is the people that I'm going to encounter, and are they going to embrace me, or are they going to kind of be wary of me because it's like, oh, we don't have a lot of black people or other people of color in the office, so do we need to kind of tread carefully in terms of our banter or what we kind of say in the office, and so on and so forth. So that kind of falls into office work culture.
Yeah.
And in terms of are they setting up policies and setting up the infrastructure that it doesn't matter where you kind of come from, that you are treated equally, because unfortunately there's been times before that I've worked in a job and I felt very, very uncomfortable because I did not feel that I was welcome. It's not necessarily on the words that they said to me, it was their actions and how they would purposely leave me out of certain meetings, leave me out of certain conversations, some of the banter that was used as well.
And again, that's the problem with this covert racism. It's partly denial.
It's culture as well.
It's culture,
The culture of society, the culture of individual workplaces, education systems. That's the big problem. It's culture.
I agree. I think when I worked in an office, I remember there one guy when I was dating my ex who was black. I don't know why he said this, but he said to me, I think some black women are attractive, but then I wouldn't want my daughter to marry a white guy.
Wow.
Now, what's that based on?
Sorry, I didn't catch. So he said. He said.
I think some black women are attractive, but I wouldn't want my daughter to marry a white man, a black man. Sorry. So where is that?
Wrong first time.
Did I? Sorry.
Yeah.
Where's that thought process come from?
Yeah.
Like, do you see what I mean? And is that cultural, or is it because we've been socialised into thinking?
You can only know by, I suppose, interrogating that man and looking back at his history. But again, just appalling, man.
What could you say to that?
How do you? Why have you even got to be put in an uncomfortable situation like that? In terms of, why is that even a sentence? Why?
So funny that you're kind of mentioning that he finds black women attractive, but he wouldn't want his daughter to date a
Black
black
guy.
man.
Yeah.
My personal experience, especially with dating, is it's a very weird phenomenon where I've had fetishism
Okay.
towards my color, that they don't see me as a person or as a female that they're attracted to because of my personality or my attitude or my morals or anything like that. It's purely because within their own community of where they were growing up, there was not a lot of people of color generally. So to come across a black female like myself, it's almost like I'm an exotic trope. Oh, this beautiful black female. I've never tried this type of thing before. It was almost more of that I was a almost like a conquest in a sense, that they've had other females before that are within their same race, but it's a new thing now to try a black woman because it's
So
so
like a
different.
trend,
Yeah,
would you say?
a trend, and also a bit of curiosity, but it's
Yeah.
curiosity in the worst ways, because of course they're not interested in knowing me as a person. It's a racist thing that they want to date me to tick off a little checklist of things that they've done that have been a little bit different, that maybe their parents would not have been doing themselves.
I did see something on Facebook. I think it was like a Daily Mail or Mirror post, and there was a black female saying, trying to explain to this guy that you can still be racist even if you're dating a black person.
Oh yeah, most
And
definitely.
he just couldn't understand that concept.
Yeah.
And again, that shows the severity of the problem.
It's like when people say, I'm not racist, I've got black friends.
It's the same principle, yeah.
Have you?
It's,
Well done, mate. But I'm fantastic. But that doesn't automatically mean you're not racist. It's not. It's not like a I'm not a racist card. That's just delusional.
But we know, like, a lot of people do use that as a defence, but it's a defence built on what exactly?
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Because
It's,
of that one black friend, they're not racist at all. But my own personal experiences is that I was dating somebody, and his group of friends, I wouldn't necessarily say that they were all out racist, but they were quite ignorant with some of their comments towards me. And when I called them out on it, they were like, "Oh, but it's fine, you're all right with us, Sabrina." And it's like, well, no, I'm not all right with it. I'm telling you that I'm not all right, and you shouldn't be using that language at all. Just because I'm friends with you does not mean that I'm not going to call you out on it.
Of course,
Yeah.
totally with you. I think, racism. We've all got our feelings on it, and we think it's definitely a problem. But it gets to a problem. I remember studying racism on my law degree. I studied the Stephen Lawrence case,
yeah.
and I don't think I've ever studied it, a topic or a case that's ever had such a huge impact upon me. What that poor boy and his family suffered, not just from the killers, but also what society showed him and the black community, well, all communities really, how kind of evil it can be and how bad society can be. It really had an emotional impact upon me. It upset me. God, I didn't really know too much about it until studying it in university, to be perfectly honest. And for anybody who's not aware of it, anyone who's a young listener, so Stephen Lawrence was a boy that was murdered. Was it 1993? I think was it. I think it was 93.
Yeah.
He was murdered by 4 or 5 white boys purely because he was black. So him and his friend were at a bus stop in Eton in London. I think it's Eton. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm not sure, but yeah, he was waiting for a bus home, and these 4 or 5 white boys just ran over and attacked him and stabbed him and killed him in just cold blood. Just no reason other than the fact he was black. And again, I'll tell a little bit more of the story just in case there's anyone who isn't aware of the story. So Stephen Lawrence was obviously murdered, and there were huge issues around the investigation. The police made error after error after error. From the police turning up to they didn't even do any first aid until the ambulance got there, neither can neither confirm nor deny may have saved him. now. So no first aid. Why is that? What's that all about? To the point that, you know, the police were given the names of the people who had, everyone believed had committed these crimes.
Yeah.
They were witnesses, not necessarily witnesses that saw it happen, but, you know, these boys were arrogant to the fact they'd done it. They were proud of doing it. And eventually 2 of them were found guilty of doing it. But during this investigation, it became abundantly clear that there was a problem with institutional racism in the Metropolitan Police. And there was numerous investigations taken upon on the Metropolitan Police, and they were found to be institutionally racist. And I think that if you're not aware of that story, you should definitely go and investigate it. I know there's been some documentaries and a drama that was on ITV on it recently. But if you do not believe there's a problem with racism, or there hasn't been a problem with racism in even the last couple of decades, watch that story and tell me there's not a problem with racism. Because for a human being to leave this world with that amount of evil in front of them, I mean, what a sight to leave this world. His last sight is 5 white men stabbing him to death for no reason other than the colour of his skin. Now, that's obviously how serious racism can be. And I believe that there's still racist murders committed, maybe not so much directly in Britain, but all over the world, without a shadow of a doubt. And I think that's why I want to get this story out and get this podcast out, because I know Black Lives Matter was huge, and you know it's had positive change to some extent, but I still think there's so much ignorance.
I think me and you went to that protest.
Bristol,
and I think it gave us a bit of confidence that there was so many people showed up with the same sort of view. But the aftermath of that, I mean, the outrage of the Colston statue coming down still showed how much further we've got to go. Because you're defending a guy that was enslaving thousands of slaves for the expense of profit, right? And a lot of the arguments on sort of Facebook were, but he put money back into Bristol and he built this and he built that. But it's irrational. I mean, you can't forgive people for such a crime just because they've given money, because it would be like forgiving Jimmy Saville, wouldn't it, for the crimes he's committed, because he ploughed a lot of money into hospitals and charities, which has helped a lot of children and a lot of unwell people. But you cannot forgive them for the crimes that they've committed.
Do you think people would walk past the statue of Jimmy Savile and be like, "Oh, well, the money he raised did do a lot of good, though.
Exactly.
He did do a lot of good, and we should remember him. We should remember him because he did do a lot of good. I know he did do a few. Do you know? It's
that's how irrational it is.
But I think the other link to it is that because Edward Colston, especially for the Black community, is a big negative no. Like, of course, I'm not going to commemorate this man because he made a profit off of slave labor. Because of the stuff that he was doing did not affect majority of the UK population, the white people that would be living there at the time. Of course, the same white people of today would be going, well, it didn't negatively affect me, it didn't affect my family line, it didn't have that big of an influence. So no, this is history, and that's the main argument that I've seen with a lot of people why they didn't want the Edward Colston statue taken down, is because they felt it was taken down of British history.
So like a road in our history.
Yeah. But I think, I know, I saw people saying, like, you should put him up in a museum and so people can go and reflect upon it and learn from our mistakes. And I just think, the very fact that there was a statue that stood there, and people will always remember there was a slave trader there, right? And we ripped him down because what he did, ultimately, whether or not in his time that was okay, ultimately it was wrong.
It was inhumane, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it was inhumane. Of course, in his time, people are always going to say, in his time, what he was doing wasn't a crime. It was normal. It was.
Yeah. That's the problem. We're using this norm of, well, he was a man of his time, But ultimately, if you break it down, the stuff he was doing was inhumane. So there's, as far as I'm concerned personally, there's no argument for that. But again, it boils back down to how history is taught, I think. And even if you look at when slavery was abolished, I think it's like 1833 in the UK, around that time, that wasn't abolished because they thought about the inhumane crimes that were being committed. It was abolished to get compensation to the slave owners, because they realised it had a shelf life because of technology was advancing.
Yep, the Industrial Revolution, it became, why should we be spending so much money on these on this task force, or the same way that you would be kind of farming animals, you have to feed them, you have to clothe them. That is literally how the slaves were seen, just as a commodity. You have to provide all of this extra stuff for them, food, warmth.
Like a business, right?
Yeah. But if you've got the Industrial Revolution where you've got a lot more focus on machinery, you don't need to feed a machine, you don't need to clothe a machine. It can just continue working for, in some cases, 24/7. But you could not do that with the slaves. So that's one of the main proponents why they ended the slave trade.
It made sense to bail out at that point, take it to Parliament and get a compensation.
Yeah.
Because ultimately it's got a shelf life.
Yeah.
And they're not going to be as valuable.
Yeah.
And it always comes down to money.
Yeah, most
Always
definitely.
comes down to
Most
money.
definitely.
Well, yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I think one of the points I know we wanted to talk about, and this is probably the most, well, we just kind of raised it, I guess, to some extent, but it's like the older generation. You know, where someone like, you've got, a grandparent, right, who's makes very racist jokes or says very racist things, right? Oh my God, but he comes from a different time, and it was right when he was like in his childhood, and that's how he grew up. It was normal.
Yeah.
And that's Grandad Phil. Sorry if there's any people called Phil who's watching, but that's Grandad Phil. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. He just makes those jokes. Well, that's like saying to someone who's making these jokes about, right? You don't have to accept those jokes when you're with me or when you're with the rest of my family, but when Grandad Phil's here, you've got to accept a bit of racism.
You've got to let it slide.
You've got to let it slide when Grandad Phil's there, okay? Because that's when racism's okay.
Yeah.
And when racism's okay, for an hour of the day when Grandad Phil's there, it's okay the rest of the time. Because you can't say it's okay for 1 hour and then the other 23 hours of the day it's always illegal now. Can't make those jokes. And ultimately, the problem is about joking about racism is ultimately any form of racism feeds the wider narrative, and that
feeds the fire, doesn't it?
Exactly, and that's when you get these, you can have the racist jokes, but then it goes all the way to the top end of the spectrum where you've got the Stephen Lawrence case.
Yeah.
One thing with the older generation though that's kind of baffled me is, like, if you look at like big events like Wimbledon, most of the crowd are like quite older, right? And when they see like Serena Williams play, they're in absolute awe of her abilities and her talents. And there's something in sport there's a purity in sport, right, and physical pursuit that we admire so much that we're willing to throw out our social orders. Because when Serena's kicking ass at Wimbledon, no one's looking at her as a black woman. They're looking at her as this is an insane athlete, and actually they're our equal. But the moment she steps off that court, she's not anymore, right? And a lot of the older generation watch Wimbledon and still have that attitude. I can't get my head around that, how you can be in such awe of someone when it's a physical pursuit. Yeah. But in any other like industry, like if she went and worked in an office, she probably received some of the stuff that you've experienced, right?
I was just about to say, actually, we've got going from Serena Williams and looking at black athletes in particular. You want just looking at the recent, was it the Champions League? Or what was the
the European
World
Cup?
the Euros. Yeah.
I knew exactly what was going to happen if England lost on those penalties, and if it was those black players that were going to be doing the penalty shootout, because as soon as I went on Instagram and I looked at Marcus Rashford's Instagram page and they lost the penalty shootout, all you saw was the monkey emoji straight away. I always just found it so funny that when we were in the quarterfinals and the semi-finals, everybody was rallying around these three black players saying, yeah, we're all inclusive. It doesn't matter whether you're black, brown, yellow, or whatever. We're English. We're fighting on the England team. But as soon as those boys lost those penalty shootouts, all I saw was the monkey emoji, and that they need to be kicked out of the country.
But it's just horrendous,
Yeah.
right? But I can't get my head around when it comes to physical pursuit, and I mean that as in a sporting sense, when you're top of your game,
Yeah.
right? The social orders, these hierarchies of race, superiority, and all that goes out the window for that brief moment that person's performing at their best and everyone's enjoying it, right? It's like, let's just say like we had a race and like whoever could run the longest, right? That was the thing. That's your colour, your education, etc., etc. It doesn't matter like in that actual race. It's whether who can do it, right? Or whoever could hold their breath the longest, right? It just destroys anything outside of you holding your breath for the longest, right? And we can praise these people when they're winning and they can do it the longest, but the moment they come off, like I said with Serena Williams, come off the court, there's, oh, she's with a white guy, oh, she's this, oh, she's doing this advert, all of these things that shouldn't matter.
There is a whole load of source material, documentaries, books, podcasts as well that talk on these specific matters, and I would welcome them to debate on why they have that certain viewpoint, and I would question them on their personal experiences to say, okay, so you've grown up in this certain environment. Is it because that you personally haven't seen it? Is it after seeing these videos? Is it just that you don't believe it? Or is there something else that is kind of saying that racism doesn't exist? Because racism is not something that's just occurred within our generation. It has occurred since essentially time began. It's the same thing, even looking at sexism. It is something that has always been there. It's always been there with humans. And it's something that I wouldn't say it's necessarily going to stop, but it's definitely something that we can counter attack to make sure that people of color like myself don't feel like we have to carry on making this big fight to say that this isn't right.
Thank you so much to our listeners and viewers for watching and listening to our podcast today. Please like, subscribe and follow, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Cheers, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.